In Boston, the mayor is pushing for rent control in the city, and in New Jersey, a landlord faces a lawsuit after the death of a tenant after not changing the locks on the apartment. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have two interesting articles for you today, and they're going over, a couple of topics that are really of interest to landlords. One being rent control, of course, and the mayor of the city of Boston, what she's trying to do right now is get rent control passed within her city, and I believe there's a state law up in Massachusetts that prevents that from happening. So she has to get the legislature to change the law just so that they could get it passed. And so that's actually a good thing for the landlords up there, that they don't have the ability to just get rent control moving. But the second article I have, it's going over an unfortunate, death that happened to a tenant inside of a landlord's apartment. And well, the family of that tenant is now suing the landlord because the landlord didn't change the locks to the unit. And I guess that they deem that as being part of the reason why this tenant died. But before I get into the articles, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what you think, okay? Do you think that, a landlord should be held responsible if a tenant passes away in a unit, if something that has absolutely nothing to do with the unit itself or with the landlord or anything that the landlord did, okay? Now, I don't know the details of this story specifically, but that's why I'm going to be going over it. So maybe I'll change my mind after I read the article, but as of right now, I don't think that this is, right, that the landlord is being blamed for the death of this tenant. So, but before we get into that, the first article, it's coming out of Massachusetts, and it's from masslive.com, and it says, Boston Mayor Michelle Wu pushing rent control policy with Governor Charlie Baker, state lawmakers. Yeah, a lot of these more progressive, left-leaning places, and Boston is up there in probably the top 5 in the entire country. They are pushing for rent control because these are expensive places, okay? Boston is known to be very, very expensive. I mean, we're talking about a large major city within the United States, very historical, very beautiful place, has several major universities nearby, has a very strong business climate, etc., right? Very, very popular place. Of course, it's going to be very expensive, right? But their solution to the affordable housing issue is to try to throw rent control in there. And this is the wrong solution, okay? And the truth of the matter is that places like New York, LA, Boston, etc., they are expensive places for a reason. It's because they're in high demand. Okay, I admit these are places where people want to live. This is places where, just people want to move into them and they are willing to pay more. The business environment in these places is so strong that just the business people wanting to come in could raise the prices of the rents. So the only way to keep rents down at that point would be to build sufficient amount of new housing in order to have a supply for the people who want to live there. And that's just not happening. It's hard to happen because these places are already very, very heavily developed. I mean, especially when we're talking about these larger East Coast cities. Okay, so it's a solution to a problem that doesn't work, and they don't seem to understand why it won't work. Okay, now the governor in this situation has already said that he is not in support of rent control, and that's a good thing. So let's get into the article and see what it says. Boston Mayor Michelle Wu said Tuesday that she and Governor Charlie Baker spoke last week during their face-to-face meeting about rent control. And while she did not suggest she had changed his mind about the policy, she said there could be a way to approach housing costs that looks different from the old style of rent control that the governor opposes. Wu championed the idea of rent control during her campaign for mayor, but to bring back the policy in Boston, she would need legislative approval and the signature of the governor. Baker has said he would be unlikely to sign rent control legislation, recalling his younger days living in Boston, where an older, more professionally established couple lived in his same building but paid less than him in rent. So, like I said, the governor has already said he doesn't like rent control. And I don't blame him, okay? I mean, what I just read is very, very typical of what happens with rent control and why I don't like it. It's part of the reason I don't like it either, okay? He said he lived in an apartment in Boston. Apparently, Boston used to have rent control back in the day, and they no longer do, right? And there was a well-to-do older couple. You know, just imagine this, like having a lawyer or a doctor living in the same building as you, but they're paying less rent than you are, and you're just a young person, you know, maybe fresh out of college, you know, much lower income, and you know, these people who've just been there for a long time get to pay lower rent than you. That doesn't even make sense. You know, they're staying in the place only because it's super cheap. Their living is subsidized, and rent control isn't based upon actual need of the people who are in the units. Everybody gets it. So you could be sitting in a place making $1 million a year and they're giving you subsidized housing. That doesn't make any sense, you know, and I'm glad that at least the governor is willing to stand up and say that. I mean, it's not very often when you hear in a very left-leaning place that they have a governor who is, at least in terms of this issue here, landlord friendly, okay? I think there's a wide range of what we can do at the city level. When cities are given the power to really explore all the nuances of how we can protect our residents, keep people in their homes, it doesn't have to look like how it's looked in the past, Wu said during her first Ask the Mayor segment of GBH's Boston Public Radio. And in fact, in the places where it's working today across the country, it looks very different, and it's in partnership with other tools and other policies that are meant to continue growing the supply of housing as well, Wu continued. Well, one of the biggest things is, right, these places that have newer rent control policies, they haven't been in place long enough so that you could start seeing the negatives, okay? They've only been in place for 5, maybe at most 10 years. Most of them haven't even been in place for 5 years. But you really start seeing these negative side effects of rent control 20, 30 years down the line, okay? When all of a sudden, you know, builders, they haven't maintained their buildings in 30 years and they're just dilapidated and falling apart. When people haven't moved out and they're, you know, you can't find anywhere to live. You know, all of the issues, they hit further in the future than these people are willing to admit, okay? So they're oh, well, this place passed rent control 2 years ago and there's no issue. Of course there's not. You know, it takes time before you really start seeing the problems. It's kind of like when you have a small leak in your roof, right? And you don't repair it. You're like, oh, no big deal. It's just a little tiny water spot in my ceiling, right? And if you leave that in place for too long, it creates a huge amount of damage, both on the outside and the inside of your house. And if you had just fixed it, or, you know, then you wouldn't have had this bigger issue. You know, it just takes time before you really start to see the damage. Okay, so it's the same thing with rent control. And, you know, I wish that these people would take a good look at the places where rent control was implemented a very long time ago and look at what the housing stock looks like. Okay, look down in New York City and see what a lot of the rent controlled housing stock looks like. Talk to the people who are, you know, just, you know, growing up, they just moved out of their parents' house. Ask them how easy it is to find a rent controlled apartment. Okay, it's not easy. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. Okay, you know, basically the programs are a joke, and it doesn't work. It doesn't actually make housing more affordable. If it did, then places like New York and San Francisco would be some of the most affordable places in the entire country to live, and it is the exact opposite. Wu did not put a timeline on a rent control proposal from her new administration, telling hosts Jim Broad and Marjorie Egan that she was focused right now on building out her cabinet and grateful that Chief of Housing Sheila Dillon has agreed to stay on at City Hall. Between her continued leadership and the ideas that we put out on the campaign trail, we'll be moving shortly, Wu said. Reinstituting rent control in Boston would require a passage of a home rule petition on Beacon Hill, and Wu began a dialogue with the Boston legislative delegation about her priorities this week when she hosted the legislators at the Parkman House next door to the State House. Yeah, so apparently, she campaigned on that. She thinks that she's going to be able to get it to pass. It's going to be an uphill battle with that state. I mean, it's possible, though. I mean, it's much more possible in a place like Massachusetts than it is here in Nebraska, okay? Nobody would be on board with that. But anyway, the second article I have for you today, and it's kind of a bad situation, and, like I was saying earlier, there was a death of Tenant and her two children, and they were killed by, I'm guessing, the spouse or the companion of that tenant, right? But what they're doing is they're suing the landlord because they had requested to have the locks changed after this other person had moved out, and the landlord didn't do it. So let's see what the article says. It's coming from NBCnews.com, and it says, "Mother, two children murdered after landlord didn't change locks," lawsuit says. A New Jersey mother begged her apartment complex to change the locks on her door, and she was granted a restraining order after she was granted a restraining order against her husband. The complex failed to fulfill her request, and the mother and two children were fatally stabbed in their home. A lawsuit filed on the family's behalf claims. The mother, Ruth Esther Reyes de Severino, and her children, Uriani and Yuri, were killed on February 5th, 2020. Police found the bodies in the family's Penns Grove Gardens apartment after they discovered the remains of Reyes de Severino's husband, Eugenio Severino, in a nearby park, according to a lawsuit obtained by NBC News. So basically what happened was, I guess, this lady's husband, right? She had a restraining order against him. He had moved out or gone away or whatever, right? And he came back. He still had the key to the apartment. So he used the key, went in, killed the lady and the two children. Okay, so now the family is suing the apartment owner. And, this is a tough case, okay? Because, you have to question, does the landlord have responsibility or liability for something that this other person did? Okay, is it the landlord's fault that she passed away? Or would he have come anyway, and if the door had been locked, would he have just kicked it in and still done exactly what he did before? Who knows? Or maybe he would have waited until she left, or waited until she opened the door, or whatever. But we don't know that. We'll never know that now. I mean, it's a terrible tragedy, and the question now for you as a landlord and for me as a landlord is, if a tenant calls me and says, it tells me this situation and asks me to change the locks, I'm going to do it, okay? I'm not going to face a lawsuit later, but on top of that, I don't want anyone to, die or get hurt because of, my lack of wanting to do my job, okay? So interesting story there. Just watch out as a landlord, for situations like this coming up.